Welcome to the Animal Law Podcast. This is Marianne Sullivan. Today I will be talking to two people who are at the Lewis and Clark Animal Law Clinic, and I am so super excited about this. It's a clinic, a law school clinic, that is completely focused on farmed animal-related litigation, and boy, it's going to change the world. I really think it will. First, Delcianna J has been on the podcast before. If you've been listening for a while, you're very familiar with her work, and she's now heading up that clinic at Lewis and Clark. And also joining us is one of the students who is heading up that litigation, Cristina Kladis, and they will be discussing the first lawsuit filed by the clinic, which just everyone is talking about this case. It's really, really crucial, and I'm so pleased that litigation has been brought regarding it. This is the lawsuit against the USDA regarding their incredibly outrageous decision to eliminate line speeds in pig slaughterhouses, which puts the animals at horrible risk and also creates risks to humans and to the environment. And it's not just the line speed that is problematic about their rule changes. There are other rule changes as well that go along with this change that are equally horrible. And we're just so happy that the clinic is taking on this case on behalf of a really amazing cohort of plaintiffs. The plaintiffs in this case are Farm Sanctuary, Animal Equality, Animal Legal Defense Fund, Center for Biological Diversity, Compassion Over Killing, Mercy for Animals, and North Carolina Farmed Animals Save. Just before we get to the interview, I'd just like to quickly ask for your support in helping us keep Our Hen House, which produces the Animal Law Podcast, along with the Our Hen House podcast, going. And if you can help out, please go to ourhenhouse.org/donate, and you can join our special band of supporters whom we call our flock, or you can make whatever donation you can afford and are comfortable with. But we would really appreciate it if you can do something. And every donation really does count. The only way to keep animal-friendly indie media going is through supporting its efforts. So I really hope you do so and support the Our Hen House podcast and this podcast. So let's get to that interview. Cristina Kladis is a third-year law student at Lewis and Clark Law School, which you may know, but you may not, is in Portland, Oregon. And she lives there with her dog, Nix. She came to law school with the plan to specialize in environmental and animal law, and she's hoping to fight factory farming and other forms of environmental injustice. And I would say she's off to a pretty amazing start early in her career. She hasn't even graduated yet. In addition to environmental and animal law, Christina's interested in prisoners' rights, free speech protections for protesters and media. And after graduating from law school, she'll be a litigation fellow at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Delcianna, or as we like to call her, Delcy Winders, who, as I mentioned, has been on the podcast a number of times before. She is now a clinical professor of law and the director of the Animal Law Litigation Clinic at Lewis and Clark. And her scholarship has appeared in a number of law reviews, and she's also published extensively in the popular media. And before Lewis and Clark, she was vice president and deputy general counsel for the PETA Foundation. She was also the first academic fellow of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program, and she was a visiting scholar at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. She also has taught animal law at Tulane and Loyola, which are both in New Orleans, and she's clerked for the Honorable Martha Craig Daughtrey in the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. She has an amazing resume there, and we're so glad that all of this experience and background is being brought to bear for farmed animals. Welcome to the Animal Law Podcast, Delcy and Cristina.
Thank you for
having us.
I'm so thrilled to have you. I mean, obviously, I want to talk about this case. This case is really important, and I'm so glad you're bringing it. But I also want to talk about the clinic because, I'm just super excited that all of this legal talent is being brought to bear for the animals. But let's get to that at the end, talking about what the clinic plans are and what's going on there at Lewis and Clark. And let's start with the case, because I think a lot of people probably have kind of heard that the USDA did something bad about pig slaughter, but they don't really know that much about it. So before we get into the law, just tell us briefly what the USDA did, and tell it what it means and how they changed the rule and anything else that they changed.
So basically, the USDA created new rules around pig slaughter, and some of the major changes are that now there's no longer a limit on how many pigs a slaughterhouse can kill per hour, and The new rule also takes away inspection responsibilities from USDA inspectors and gives it to untrained slaughterhouse employees.
I think a lot of us had heard about the line speed, don't know a lot about it, but heard about the line speed. But there's this other really important aspect that you're talking about.
Yeah. So the inspection duties being reassigned to slaughterhouse workers is one of the new parts of the rule that we're challenging. And basically, it takes away the pre-slaughter inspection responsibilities and gives them to the slaughterhouse workers who have no training requirements under the law. So there's really no way to ensure that humane handling regulations are being followed.
Yeah, it really is pretty unbelievable. David Bolston and I wrote an article years and years and years ago called Foxes in the Henhouse, and it just keeps happening over and over. They keep, I'm not sure I would call slaughterhouse workers the foxes. They're more like the foxes' lackeys or victims in so many ways. But really, they just keep trying to put the people who are doing things to animal in charge of what they can do. And here we're seeing another instance of this. So what are the implications for the animals, basically?
Beginning with the no more line speed limits, I think that represents a clear giveaway to the meat industry. The line speed limits are important because the law requires the Department of Agriculture to ensure that pigs are unconscious when they're slaughtered. So without any limits, pigs' throats could be cut when they're still conscious, and pigs could be boiled alive in scalding water. And, there's evidence that when line speeds are increased, humane handling violations also increase.
It seems inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be the animals who are going to be the victims here. But you've also pointed to other harms as well, right? Environmental harms, potential health harms.
Absolutely. The whole point of the new rule is to increase efficiency in slaughterhouses. So now we expect that around 11.5 million more pigs a year will be slaughtered. And already about 124 million pigs were already being slaughtered in a year. So it's going to increase factory farming and all of the environmental impacts that come from that, like increased manure, increased environmental justice implications. And also because slaughterhouse employees themselves will be conducting some of the inspection duties without any required training, there are great chances that food safety risks will also increase.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's a good summary of what's happening. Let's start out by getting into what laws apply here and the relevant statutes. And obviously one of the important statutes that's at issue here is the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. So can you just kind of go through what the relevant requirements are in that statute that are at issue here?
Yeah, so the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act basically applies from when animals reach the slaughterhouse and up to and including the moment of slaughter. And it requires that the slaughtering and handling of animals be carried out only by humane methods. So humane handling requirements that are in the law require that when animals first arrive at the slaughterhouse on trucks, they be unloaded in a way that doesn't harm them. And then animals should be led to the slaughter area at natural, manageable speeds. They shouldn't be forced to move faster than at a normal walking pace. And tools like electric prods that are sometimes used to drive the animals to the slaughter area are supposed to be used as little as possible. And so these are some of the areas where USDA inspectors would be involved and they'd be watching the employees, but now the slaughterhouse employees themselves will be handling the inspection duties here. So it's kind of up to them to ensure that the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act is followed here. And also importantly, at the pre-slaughter stage, inspectors are supposed to kind of sort the pigs. So they're supposed to sort the pigs that seem healthy from the pigs that don't. So they're looking for animals with symptoms of disease and separating them from the other animals so they could be slaughtered separately. And kind of a lot comes into play there. Inspectors should be looking for animals when they're at rest and when they're at motion to see if they may be disabled. And disabled pigs that can't walk, or down pigs as they're sometimes called, are supposed to be separated and kept in a pen because there are some food safety issues with slaughtering them with the healthy pigs, but there are also a lot of humane issues here because disabled pigs that can't walk often have a lot of the worst humane handling violations because it's kind of hard to move them. So another thing that comes into play under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act is that these animals that can't walk are not supposed to be dragged on the ground while they're still conscious, and they're not supposed to have electric prods used on them in a way that would excite them, and a lot of things like that.
Yeah, you can just imagine the picture of how the line speed kind of controls everything. You know, that's the pace. The line speed controls the pace, and then everything else leading up to that would vary according to how fast you have to do everything. So it's pretty obvious that this would have enormous impacts on people following the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. Now, I know the Federal Meat Inspection Act is also very involved. And can you explain, for me as well as for everybody else, exactly how the Federal Meat Inspection Act links up with the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and what it incorporates and what it adds to the requirements there?
I want to jump in quickly before Cristina addresses that question. I'm really glad that in discussing the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, she emphasized all of those handling requirements and everything that the pigs endure prior to the moment of slaughter, because oftentimes folks think about the Humane Slaughter Act as simply requiring animals to be rendered unconscious before they're killed. And that's a really important part of it. And I want to make sure that doesn't get lost in all of this. So, but it's not all that this is about. The Humane Methods of Slaughter Act governs every moment of the pig's time while they're alive at the slaughterhouse. And a lot of these violations do happen before they're actually at the point of being shackled and hoisted and having their throats slit. But that is another piece of the law that is being violated more frequently now without line speeds, is that in addition to all of these handling violations, animals being dragged and beaten and trampled to try and get them to move along more quickly, they're also increasing the likelihood that they're not going to be properly stunned because they're trying to move along so quickly, which means that when it's time for them to have their throats slit, they're more likely to be conscious, and USDA has documented this happening. They may even be conscious when they reach the scalding tanks, which are boiling hot tanks of water. So that's another piece of this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's true that people do overlook the handling requirements in addition to the crucial requirement that they be unconscious when their throats are slit, and both of those requirements are being affected by this new rule. So back to my other question about the statute, the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Can you explain exactly what that does?
The Federal Meat Inspection Act was enacted to protect the health and welfare of consumers by making sure that meat and meat products are wholesome. And the Federal Meat Inspection Act literally mandates that the USDA appoint inspectors to inspect animals sold for food. And that, of course, includes pigs. So under the act, meat can't be sold unless it was inspected by federal inspectors, both pre and post slaughter. So we've kind of talked about a lot of the pre-inspection duties, like making sure that the disabled animals or animals with symptoms of disease are separated. And the Federal Meat Inspection Act talks about that a lot, and it explicitly mandates that that is done by USDA inspectors. In addition, during the slaughter line, basically the order of how it works is that first animals are stunned, and it incorporates the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and that kind of approves a few different methods of stunning for pigs, which includes using a carbon dioxide gas chamber, captive bolt stunners, stunning by gunshot, or stunning by electric current. So those are the only ways that animals are supposed to be rendered unconscious. So after that happens, the Federal Meat Inspection Act says that pigs are then suspended. And that entails a pig being shackled, normally by a leg, and hoisted. And then the pig's throat is stabbed with a knife so they can be bled out, which kind of just lets the blood drip out of their body. And then at that point, pigs go into a scalding tank, which is filled with hot water, and it's meant to loosen and kind of remove the hair from their bodies. And then after all of that's done, the pig then moves down the line to like the dismemberment stage, where it's cut into different sorts of meat products.
And I think, as is probably clear by this point, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act are sort of inextricably intertwined. So the Federal Meat Inspection Act incorporates by reference the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act and provides many of the implementation and enforcement requirements. So it's hard to separate those two out.
Yeah, maybe that's why I always get them confused. Well, not confused exactly. I do know they're separate, but the requirements of one and the requirements of the other when they apply. All right, then. So we are going through all the law, and I wasn't sure whether this was a good way to organize this, but I'm going to, because I want to go through all the statutes. But the other statute that is involved here is really kind of different. It's not directly governing the behavior of everyone during slaughter. And that's NEPA. And I'm excited that NEPA is one of my favorite statutes. So I'm excited that you brought a NEPA claim here. And it certainly seems like a valid one. But can you just talk a little bit about what NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. And now I'm falling into the sin of all environmental lawyers, even though I'm not one using acronyms for everything. So this is the statute. Well, people may not have necessarily have heard of NEPA. They've certainly heard of environmental impact statement assessments. And can you talk a little bit about when an environmental impact assessment is needed and why you think it applies here?
NEPA requires that federal agencies evaluate the environmental effects of their proposed regulations to kind of help them fully understand the environmental implications of that regulation. And they're supposed to be looking for direct environmental effects, indirect environmental effects, and cumulative environmental effects. So, for example, here, we believe that the new slaughter rule will increase pig slaughter, and the USDA has said that they expect that pig slaughter will be increased 12.5%, which would lead to around 11.5 million more pigs being slaughtered annually. So this increase in pig slaughter, we believe, will likely cause adverse environmental effects from factory farming and even just from waste from the slaughterhouses themselves. So we believe that the USDA should have looked into the possible environmental ramifications of increased productivity at pig slaughterhouses.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as soon as I read it, it made sense to me. But of course, the environmental effects are going to go downstream. If you're slaughtering more pigs, then you're raising more pigs and you're shipping more pigs. So it's not just the environmental effects at the slaughterhouse themselves. By allowing the slaughter of so many more animals, you're just increasing our pig capacity in this country. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And that's why it's so important that NEPA doesn't just look at direct impacts. That's such a narrow way of how the environment works, because we know that everything is interlinked. NEPA specifically requires you look at indirect impacts and cumulative impacts. And that's precisely what happens when you're incentivizing the slaughter of millions more animals who are going to be raised on factory farms. And the law clearly requires an agency to take account of those factors. They can't disregard them just because they're not happening at the slaughterhouse. Although I should note there are also, significant pollution happening at the slaughterhouse level as well. But it's not just at the slaughterhouse level. So NEPA requires the agency to consider these factors and to prepare a report on them so that the public is apprised and knows what's the implications of the agency action are.
Yeah. No, I've inserted NEPA here because it is the subject of one of your causes of action. But let's go into more of the details of what their arguments are vis-a-vis NEPA when we get to that cause of action. I just wanted to get that basic overview of what statutes we're talking about here. And of course, those three statutes lay out requirements, but they don't provide an avenue for you to sue. And all three of your causes of action are actually brought pursuant to the Administrative Procedure Act, right?
Yeah. And the Administrative Procedure Act is a law that governs the way federal agencies make regulations, and it's there to ensure that agencies don't overstep their power and that there are uniform standards for rulemaking. And it also importantly requires that the public get to participate in the rulemaking process, which is why we have things like public comments on rulemaking and why the agencies are required to take into account the public's opinion.
And it also provides an avenue for judicial review for certain plaintiffs. And can you tell us the provisions? I know one is arbitrary, that it's arbitrary and capricious, but there are a few provisions that of the Administrative Procedure Act that administrative regulations have to comply with, that you can sue if they are violating them. And can you just kind of go through that?
Yeah, so a big one, and the ones that folks have probably heard of most often, are a prohibition on arbitrary and capricious rulemaking, as well as rulemaking that is an abuse of discretion. And so the APA provides that a court can review agency actions, including regulations like the one at issue here. And if they were arbitrary or capricious, they should be set aside. And I can talk more about what it means to be arbitrary and capricious if you want. But the other...
let's talk about that more in the when we talk about how the context of let's just go over the basic standards now.
Okay. Yep. And so the other provision of the APA that we're relying on this lawsuit is a prohibition on agency actions that are in excess of their statutory jurisdiction, authority, or limitations. So, Congress issues statutes, and those say how far an agency can go and how much they can delegate outside their power and what they need to do. And so if they overstep those limits, that can also be overturned under the Administrative Procedure Act.
Okay, like telling Slaughterhouse employees to do their job for them. Not that I'm getting ahead of myself here.
And then lastly, the last provision of the APA that we're relying on requires them to observe legally required procedures, like following NEPA and doing environmental assessments.
Yeah, imagine that. To follow the law. Since this is an animal law case, obviously having a cause of action is not enough. You really have to worry. Well, and everybody has to worry about whether they have standing under the Constitution, under Article 3. But animal lawyers always have to worry about it more than anybody. And I really want to go into this in some detail. Of course, not the main, but, frequently the sticking point for animal lawyers is the ability to show injury. And the animals don't get to sue. Humans have to sue. So humans have to show injury. And I think that you have a bunch of different organizations that have very different injury arguments. And I know that's always a good idea going into court. And I think it's a kind of interesting variety. So let's get into these a bit. I think all of them, correct me if I'm wrong, are alleging some sort of haven standing. Can you go into that a little bit?
I'm going to let Cristina talk about havens, but North Carolina Farmed Animal Save does not actually have a havens.
Oh, okay.
Allegation. The rest do.
I do want to get to them, though, because they have some cool arguments.
I think so.
So I will start off by saying that we absolutely believe we have standing, and we, like you said, we have a few different arguments for why. And Haven's Realty standing, we're basically saying that the client organizations have been forced to expend resources to publicize and also counteract the new slaughter rule, which is their injury.
And they're also going to be forced to take a lot of actions in light of the USDA's rule that they wouldn't have to do but for that. So, for example, Compassion Over Killing, which actually did a pretty damning investigation in one of the pilot high-speed pig slaughterhouses, is going to have to ramp up their investigations of pig slaughterhouses that are approved under this new rule. Similarly, groups like Farm Sanctuary and Animal Equality are going to have to be engaged in more efforts to get information from the government and then publicize that information to make people aware of the types of violations, including humane handling and food safety violations that are happening. A number of our clients in this case are also engaged in legislative efforts to try and overturn the rule or mitigate the impact of the rule. So there's a whole variety of ways in which the plaintiffs in this case are really having to divert resources that they would normally use on their core mission activities, focused on fighting farmed animal abuse that is horrific but not illegal, and now they're having to divert resources to address this patently unlawful rule.
What about the Center for Biological Diversity? Since they're more of an environmental organization than an absolute animal protection organization, do their havens arguments differ at all?
So their arguments are somewhat different. I mean, they're certainly overlapping, but they also are very interested in the environmental impacts of the rule and having to try and mitigate those impacts and raise awareness of those impacts. And in addition to their havens allegations, they and a number of the other plaintiffs also assert associational standing on behalf of their members who live near slaughterhouses that have said that they plan to adopt high-speed slaughter and will pay the costs both environmentally and aesthetically of those actions under the new rule.
Yeah, can you just go into that a little bit more, like how that kind of associational standing works and what specific harms some of these members of these organizations are alleging?
Haven standing is where an organization has standing in its own right. So it doesn't matter about its members. It's really about the organization itself having its mission thwarted and being forced to divert resources as a result. And associational standing is more based on the members of an organization. So the organization is sort of standing in the shoes of its members and going into court to advocate for its members' interests. And in this case, those interests there are a number of individuals who are members of the Center for Biological Diversity, Animal Legal Defense Fund, Farm Sanctuary, who live near the slaughterhouse. We know from the USDA which slaughterhouses plan to convert to high-speed slaughter under this rule. And we know folks who are members of these groups who live near those slaughterhouses and who are going to be witnessing increased trucks full of animals and all of the pollution that comes from that, the water waste from the influx of millions of more pigs being killed each year, air pollution, etc. Okay,
so that you had mentioned before, North Carolina Farmed Animal Save. Can you talk a little bit about how their injury allegations differ from the other organizations?
Yeah, so the other organizations are really focused on aesthetic injuries resulting from environmental harms, as well as increased risks of exposure to, disease-causing agents and pollution that can cause illnesses. North Carolina Farmed Animal Save has a different style of aesthetic injury. They're a group who holds vigils outside of slaughterhouses to bear witness to these pigs in their last moments, including at some of the slaughterhouses that have noted their intent to convert to high speed under the rule. And so what is going to happen to them as a result of this rule, as a direct result of this rule, is that they're going to see more animals coming into the slaughterhouse and more animals who are likely to be sick and injured and who are not going to get the care that they need because the USDA is not inspecting the animals at the point that they arrive at the slaughterhouse as is required by statute.
So this is a very specific kind of, would you call this an aesthetic injury? I noticed in your papers you called it an emotional injury, particularly the witnessing, which is, what their mission is to witness. What kind of injury are you calling this?
I would call it both aesthetic and emotional. I think under the case law, particularly ALDF versus Glickman and the Ringling Brothers case, the courts have sort of emotional injuries are, you could say, a flavor of aesthetic injuries. So I think the two are intertwined, and they have both here.
So are you going to try to get Joaquin Phoenix to join this lawsuit since he was at a Pig Save event just a few days ago?
I would love to have Joaquin Phoenix do anything with the clinic.
If you get him, I want credit for that idea. Though you probably thought of it also. All right, so that's the plaintiffs. Let's talk about the defendants, the USDA and the FSIS. Can you tell us what their different roles are?
Yeah, so the USDA is in charge of a lot of different things. Whether it's SNAP benefits, food safety, forestry, they cover a lot of things. But they are in charge of ensuring that the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act are enforced. And the Food Safety and Inspection Service is kind of like the public health wing of the USDA. It's a sub-agency of the USDA, and it is the agency that actually does the inspections in slaughterhouses and comes up with the regulations we're discussing today.
That kind of gets the parties out of the way and the statutes. So let's get into the facts in a little bit more detail than we have already. And I think that requires, as you did in your complaint, going back in time a little bit and figuring out how this all started back in the 90s. There were some changes in the way slaughter, as I understand it, in some slaughterhouses was being overseen. And you refer to a process called HIMP. Do they call it HIMP or HIMP? Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so there are a lot of acronyms at play here, and so it can get pretty confusing. So HIMP is an acronym that refers to the pilot program that was launched in 1997 to allow 5 slaughterhouses to engage in high-speed slaughter. And HIMP actually is an acronym that contains an acronym. So HIMP stands for HACCP-Based Inspection Models Project. And HACCP, HACCP, stands for Hazardous Analysis and Critical Control Point Program, which is a USDA program under which meat slaughterhouses and other facilities self-regulate food safety hazards. So within this regime of allowing increased self-regulation of food safety hazards, this was adopted into a broader program to allow more self-regulation of humane handling as well. And so HIMP is the pilot program. That's the acronym that's referred to that. And in 1997, the USDA granted 5 slaughterhouses basically what they referred to as a, quote, waiver from the law, saying they didn't have to comply with line speed limits and they could have fewer agency inspectors.
So there's a lot of evidence here about what happened when they did this, which you can use. And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, it sounds like there have been a lot of problems, which doesn't seem like a good basis for expanding this to everybody. So even from within the USDA, the Office of Inspector General reports, and we always love the Office of Inspector General at the USDA because they're always like saying all these terrible things are happening that we would not otherwise know about. So what have they been saying about these processes, both on food safety and humane handling grounds? They've been pretty harsh, right?
Yeah. So the Government Accountability Office and the USDA Office of Inspector General both audited the pilot program and noted that the USDA couldn't ensure the humane handling of pigs, and that even if inspectors noted humane handling violations, they didn't always act. Or if they did act, they didn't act in a way that was forceful enough to make the slaughterhouses not violate the humane handling regulations again. And they also found that under the new pilot program, there is a higher potential of food safety risks.
So they did this pilot program. It didn't work, so they decided to extend it to everybody. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a pretty Orwellian situation we got going.
Yeah. No, there was I remember reading some language, and you used the word Orwellian, and I thought, yeah, exactly. But that's not the only evidence you have brought forth. You also mentioned before that one of your plaintiffs is Compassionate Overkilling, which just changed its name to Animal Outlook, I should mention. And they've done, and their undercover investigations have revealed a lot of evidence that you seem to be relying on. Can you tell us, don't go into terrible detail, but into some detail about what they discovered in undercover investigations that's relevant here?
So in 2015, Compassion Overkilling did an undercover investigation in one of the 5 slaughterhouses in the pilot program, and it was a supplier to Hormel. And basically, the investigator recorded and saw conscious pigs being dragged on the floor, overuse of electric prods to drive the animals, and downed pigs being dragged. They also saw animals that were still conscious being stunned, and what looked like animals entering the scalding tanks of hot water still conscious. And each one of those things is a violation of the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act.
And so, as we mentioned, they then, having gathered all this information and animal advocacy groups finding out that things were really bad, they decided to make everything a lot worse. And so this proposal of changing these rules, both the line speed and the inspections, came out in 2018, right? And was subject to comments. And can you tell us a little bit about the comments that were received?
It's pretty interesting. The agency received a huge number of comments, more than 83,000 comments. And what's notable is that the vast, vast majority of them were in opposition to the proposed rule. So the Washington Post actually did an analysis of the comments. Sorry, it was more than 83,000. And the Post found that 87% were negative. And the opposition didn't just come from our clients, the animal protection organizations. It came from a really broad range of both organizations and individuals, including USDA inspectors themselves, some who have actually come out and spoken publicly about their concerns about this rule, slaughterhouse workers, folks who represent slaughterhouse workers, consumers, consumer advocacy organizations, public health organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So there was massive opposition. And what I think is particularly notable that the USDA acknowledged that the only folks who spoke in favor of the rule were, quote, swine slaughter establishments, trade associations representing the pork industry, and a few private citizens.
Wow. So what exactly does this, in spite of these comments, of course, the final rule went into effect recently, which is, why we're talking. And what exactly does the final rule do?
It really does some of the things we mentioned, like it removed the slaughter line speed limit. So now slaughterhouses can kill as many pigs per hour as they want. And the inspection duties that we mentioned at the pre-slaughter stage are no longer being conducted by USDA employees, but it's up to the untrained slaughterhouse workers to do the pre-slaughter inspections and ensure that the humane handling regulations are being followed, even though they're not being trained on what those are. So those are the two parts of
I don't think I asked you. So what were the line speed requirements before this, and where were they found?
Before the new rule.
Yes, before the new rule.
1,106 pigs were allowed to be killed per hour.
And where was that? Was that in the regs or?
Yeah, that was in the Code of Federal Regulations.
Okay, thanks.
And that was in place for many years.
So that's what the rule did. And let's talk about, finally, let's get to your lawsuit. We've already covered, of course, a lot of what's covered in it. But your first cause of action is about the inspections. And this is the piece, even though it's enormously important, that really hasn't been talked about as much in the news articles as line speed. Can you just lay out your arguments of, I think that you argue that it's both arbitrary and capricious and exceeds the agency's jurisdiction. And can you just lay that out a bit, how this fits into those requirements?
So we're arguing that the pre-slaughter inspection responsibilities being delegated to slaughterhouse employees violates the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and the Administrative Procedure Act. And that's because the Federal Meat Inspection Act explicitly mandates that USDA inspectors examine and inspect all animals before they enter the slaughterhouse. And that includes the pigs that are too sick or injured to walk, and that is really being neglected at this stage. And so we're saying that the USDA failed to meaningfully consider the evidence in the record that allowing slaughterhouse employees to inspect animals is likely to increase the risk of humane handling violations.
And there's a delegation issue as well. Is there any requirement that the inspectors themselves do the inspections and that they not delegate this to slaughterhouse employees?
It does say explicitly that USDA inspectors are to examine and inspect all animals before they enter any slaughterhouse. And so it doesn't say that they're allowed to give away these duties to slaughterhouse employees. And it even says that the cost for these inspection duties are only supposed to be borne by the government itself.
Well, that would seem to be obviously violated if slaughterhouse employees are doing it because the slaughterhouse is paying them.
Yeah,
you are correct. Yeah. So there's some pretty blatant violations of statutory mandates here, as well as the broader arbitrary and capricious claim that the agency failed to consider voluminous evidence in front of it and actually promulgated a rule that is contrary to the evidence that was in the record.
Yeah. And I think you already talked about this, but I just want to revisit that point that these slaughterhouse employees are under an enormous, how can they possibly do this? They would have to slow the line. They'd get fired. I mean, how could they possibly think that it would be a good idea in maintaining their job to call out the slaughterhouse on mishandling animals? Obviously, the pressure on them, and if you're working at this job in a slaughterhouse, your options are probably not great because not too many people want these jobs unless they really need the job. The pressure on them must be enormous to not call out any violations.
Yeah, and there was evidence in the record. I mean, there were statements from slaughterhouse workers, declarations from slaughterhouse workers about how they fear retaliation. And so there are all sorts of incentives in place for them not to report things and for them to move animals along as quickly as possible and to put as many as possible onto the slaughter line. And I just want to be clear that we're very sympathetic to the slaughterhouse workers as well. They're in a really, really bad situation. They're disproportionately undocumented workers, people of color, people who don't have other options. They're not doing this work because they want to. And there is a separate lawsuit that was brought by unions and folks representing the workers that's also challenging this rule. Our suit focuses on the animals themselves, but the workers are also really being screwed by this rule.
Yeah, I just totally like they have to choose basically between pissing off their employer or violating the law.
Yep.
They can't comply with the law and carry out their employer's wishes. It's crazy. It's totally crazy. There's a huge conflict of interest.
Yep.
Does that cover everything on should I move on to the second cause of action? Is that everything you want to say about the first one?
Yeah, I think that's the heart of it.
Okay, because the second cause of action is the one that most people have heard about it. It's the revocation of the line speeds, which, as you pointed out, used to be in the regs. Can you explain your argument as to why this is arbitrary and capricious? Why can't they just change this regulation?
We're arguing that removing the maximum line speeds violates the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, and the Administrative Procedure Act because for so long the USDA did set a maximum line speed limit of, like we said, 1,106 pigs killed per hour. And they got this maximum number of pigs based on what they thought inspectors could reasonably inspect in an hour, but still follow the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. So we're saying that the USDA failed to examine the data in front of it, basically, regarding the relationship between increased line speeds and inhumane handling. And they didn't explain why they have this major about face now. And so the decision to just remove the line speeds is arbitrary, capricious, and an abuse of discretion.
And that's an important point to underscore. It's bad enough that the agency is disregarding all of this evidence in front of it and promulgating a rule that's contrary to it. But agencies also have a heightened burden to explain what they're doing when they reverse course, when they've, for years said we need to do this. And that actually reminds me of something that I did want to mention with regard to the first claim about the inspection of the animals when they arrive at the slaughterhouse and delegating that to the slaughterhouse workers, because this is another area where the USDA has reversed course in a really serious way. So for many years, the USDA took the position that the frontline inspections, the inspections before the animals were even allowed to enter the slaughterhouse, not only were they required by statute, but they were one of the single most important ways to detect potentially devastating diseases. And the USDA actually argued this in the Supreme Court when they were opposing California's law that would have prohibited the slaughter of downed pigs. They basically said, you're interfering with our authority. We need to see every single animal before they go into the slaughterhouse because otherwise we're not going to be able to prevent these massive disease outbreaks. And so they're reversing course, and notably they're doing so at a time when African swine fever has already killed a quarter of the pigs population and is posing an existential threat to pigs all over the world, and the USDA is spending millions of dollars to try and guard against this threat. Yet what they've themselves recognized as an important first-line protection, they're doing away with.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable. Not that it's pig-related, but just the presence of the new coronavirus that we're reading about in the news from China, which is animal-related. It's from wild animal markets in China. Like, it just highlights the disease risks here are enormous, and they're not just to pigs, so that's bad enough, and they're not just to people who eat pork. They're to everyone. They could be wiping out the world here. All right, I'll try to come down.
No, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I kind of am. Well, you were talking before about Orwellian, and I don't know what context this is in. I'm really sorry, but You did mention this one point. I think it might have had to do with the line speed, where they're arguing that line speed is governed by the amount of pigs that are being slaughtered, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that more pigs will actually be sent to slaughterhouses. At the same time that they're arguing that they need to do this because they're going to be slaughtering so many more pigs. Can you just talk about those two different arguments, that they're going to be slaughtering so many more pigs and that's why they're doing this, and this won't result in any problems because they're not going to be slaughtering any more pigs? Wasn't there some kind of combination of arguments there?
Yeah. The USDA really wants to have its cake and eat it too. And we've seen that actually. So in the worker case that I mentioned, that was filed a little bit before our case. So there was already a motion to dismiss filed in that case. And one of the arguments that the USDA has raised is that, well, we don't know if you're going to be injured because we don't really know how many more pigs are going to be slaughtered or how many slaughterhouses are going to adopt this new rule. But their very justification for the rule was that this is going to increase producer efficiency. Yeah. And they got it down to, the exact dollar amounts, $86.7 million, I think, annually, that this will increase profits, 12.49% increase in speeds. They identified 35 specific facilities that they have determined, quote, will convert to high-speed slaughter that are responsible for 93% of the pigs slaughtered in this country. So the entire justification for the rule, because it's all about helping producers increase profits and streamline things, was the fact that more pigs would be slaughtered and profits would be increased. And yet when they're trying to rebut our claims, they're saying, well, we don't really know. We have to wait and see.
Yeah, it's crazy. And anybody who knows about the potential for increased pork exports to China, of course, the potential is unlimited for how many pigs they will be able, whose flesh they will be able to sell in this world. I mean, clearly production will go up. It's unlimited until we get cell-based pork, of course, on the market and stop this entire industry. But again, I digress. I think the reason I'm digressing is because I'm nervous about getting to your third cause of action, which has to do with the NEPA violations, which is a little, there's a few complications here and a few things to explain. So first of all, we discussed before that when the statute requires an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment, which is kind of like a lesser level of an environmental impact statement, if I understand it correctly. So before we even get to the agency's claim that doesn't apply to them, why do you believe that one is required here? What is the trigger for an environmental impact statement?
Whenever there's a major federal action that could significantly affect the quality of the human environment, that's the exact language from the statute. Agencies need to take a hard look at and prepare an environmental impact statement to see what the possible impacts of their new rule could be. And like we said, there are a lot of things they need to consider, whether it's direct, indirect, or cumulative impacts. And so they just completely did not do that here.
And now, so the USDA's argument is that there is a categorical exclusion that applies here. And can you tell us what a categorical exclusion is and why what the scope of the one they are claiming is?
Basically, under NEPA, an agency can, quote, categorically exclude certain actions from preparing an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement if that action is not going to have significant environmental effects. And that's a big, big if. So there is a regulation that was promulgated years ago that says actions by the Food Safety Inspection Service, as well as a bunch of USDA's other sub-agencies, are categorically excluded from NEPA. But that regulation itself still requires that if there are significant environmental effects, an action cannot be categorically excluded. And
there are exceptions to the exclusion.
Exactly. And so the bottom line is that if there's a possibility for significant environmental effects, it cannot be excluded. You need to assess those effects. And the USDA has just refused to engage with that argument. It was presented to them in comments and pointed out that they didn't even fall within the terms of their own categorical exclusion. And they didn't engage with that argument whatsoever.
Well, I can see why they wouldn't engage with it. Well, of course, until you get the responding papers, you could never imagine what arguments they're going to come up with. But like, it's hard to imagine, like pig slaughter. What possible environmental effects could there be from pig slaughter? It's crazy.
Killing 11.5 million pigs, factory farming those animals.
It's crazy. Sure. All right, I think that covers. I mean, of course, we're in early days here, and you know, you don't even have their papers yet, as I understand. Have I missed anything that you want to talk about at this juncture?
I just wanted to mention a couple big picture thoughts or commentary on this. As I think your listeners know, farmed animals have so few legal protections. So, you know, their treatment the entire time that they're being raised is generally not regulated at all. And so we have this one federal law that governs this important moment of their lives leading up to their deaths. And now the USDA is gutting that as well. And so taking away this little bit of protection that these animals have. And I also, you sort of alluded to this before, Marianne. So pigs, the pig export to China is increasing dramatically because of the pig population in China dying off because of African swine fever. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that despite everything we're hearing about plant-based options being more available and more in demand, the number of pigs slaughtered in the U.S. for U.S. consumption and of other animals slaughtered in the U.S. has continued to go up, even if we're not accounting for the exports. So we have a tremendous responsibility to these billions of animals who are being killed, and to at least ensure that the minimal protections that our legislature has deigned to grant them are being enforced.
Yeah, absolutely. And well said. I'm so glad you guys have brought this lawsuit. I think when all of us read about this, we were horrified. And I'm so glad that the clinic is, not only that the lawsuit is being brought, but that the clinic is the ones who are bringing it. And which just I know I know you have to get out of here. And but before you go, can you just tell us a little bit about the clinic, how it works, what your hopes are for it, and maybe a few other plans that you have in addition to this lawsuit, which really seems like enough to take up your whole year. But
So the Animal Law Litigation Clinic is based at Lewis and Clark, and it is the only law school clinic focused on farmed animal advocacy. And so it really helps us students not only learn the basics of litigation and get real courtroom experience, but we're doing it on a topic that we're all very passionate about. And so I'm definitely very grateful that I'm here and that I get to be a part of this first lawsuit. But we definitely have a lot of more exciting things coming up too.
Yeah, we have, Marianne, as you can imagine, I have like a very long list of cases that I want to bring, and we're trying to pace ourselves because we have a dual mission of bringing important cases to advocate for farmed animals while also training the next generation of lawyers who are going to spend their lives advocating for these animals. And so we do hope to be filing 2 more lawsuits this semester, and we can't talk too much about those, but I hope that folks will stay tuned, and there is much more to come.
I'm going to have to start doing more animal law podcasts with everything that's going on. It's crazy.
You really are.
I'm super excited, and I want to hear about all of them. And I'm so glad it's there. I'm so glad it's about farm animals, and I'm super excited about it. So thanks so much for doing it all. Thank you for bringing this case. I think so many people are so thrilled that you brought this case, and it sounds amazing, and I have high hopes for it. And thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Animal Law Podcast. We'll be back next month with a new show, and thank you so much to Cristina and Delcy for sharing their thoughts and expertise with us regarding this really groundbreaking case we'll be keeping a close eye on. Thank you to John Frusciante for his help in producing this podcast, and if you like what you hear, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher. Consider leaving us a good review on Apple Podcasts, and if you're able, of course, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at ourhenhouse.org/donate. And thanks so much for tuning in.